Hi and welcome to our special science art film video. We are here today to talk about the 2011 science fiction film Rise of the Planet of the Apes, which is about our desire to develop biomedical solutions, species enhancement, troubling questions about control, but also really our place in the natural world and our responsibilities to non-human species. I'm very delighted to welcome Dr. Gemma King, a senior lecturer in French at the Australian National University, who is interested in the representation of social power and minority languages, especially signed languages. And that's, of course, really fascinating and interesting in relation to our film. So, Gemma, what is particularly interesting about this film for you?
I have many answers to that question, Anna-Sophie. The first would be that I hadn't seen this film since it had come out in 2011, and I had a really murky memory of it. And when I came back to it recently, in my mind I was thinking, oh, this is just like a pulpy science fiction, CGI-reliant film. But actually, no, I was incredibly touched by Caesar's plight in this film, and I was really struck by the parallels between this film and a number of kind of cinematic tropes and historical traditions in cinema, one of which being, of course, the mad scientist that I know you're the expert in, but specifically the kind of Frankenstein trope of the mad scientist who creates this part organic, part synthetic hybrid that's more than the sum of its parts, treats it like a son and then abandons it. And so I found this to be like a really refreshing and deep and exciting exploration of the themes of the Frankenstein narrative in a new kind of context. But I think Rise of the Planet of the Apes is one of the most kind of commercially successful, widely seen representations of apes that learn to sign. And I think what's really interesting about this representation is that it's both kind of progressive and conservative in the way that it depicts sign language and its connection to intelligence and what it means to be human. So in the film, Caesar is obviously artificially, synthetically enhanced to have an intelligence that is perhaps comparable to humans or perhaps even exceeds it. And one of the first signs we see of his intelligence is that he starts to sign. However, the moment at which we understand him to be perhaps human is when he learns to speak. So this harks back to some really kind of offensive traditions in cinema that depict deaf people and sign language users as perhaps more childish or animalistic, as sign language as being more of a kind of basic system of communication as opposed to the sophistication of verbal language. And that's a really damaging, incorrect trope because sign languages are just as complex and just as complete and just as linguistically rich as verbal languages. But films like this definitely play into the perception that sign is not as complex or valuable as speech.
Wow, so this film revolves around signs. Is that something special and rare in this context, the context you just mentioned?
This is probably the example I've seen where it goes into the most detail. But if we look at examples like Godzilla vs. Kong, which came out, I think it was 4 years ago, perhaps an inferior film in terms of narrative pacing and plot, but very similar themes. Sign is used in particular to denote innocence. So Kong signs with a young character who is a deaf Indigenous child. And so we actually often see these kinds of representations of innocence, vulnerability, spiritual connection to nature, connected with sign in films that depict signing animals and signing Indigenous people. So this is something that really deserves further analysis. It's something that hasn't been drawn out in the literature yet, but it's a recurring connection that can be quite troubling, I think, and also plays into the history of representations of apes like King Kong, for example, as connected with the ways in which white people have treated Black and enslaved Africans and African Americans in cinema and history. So there are some really deep kind of racial, minority, culture, linguistic connections that can sometimes infantilize Indigenous, Black and Deaf characters. So this is another example of that.
There are so many layers. Thank you so much for being here. I have so many more questions, but we need more film nights like that. Do you have anything you would like to leave with us for our discussion today?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had a question for the panel, even though I'm not there, I'm so sorry. I would love to know what you think about the representation of how science is done in this film. In particular, the way in which, for example, a vaccine is given to a character and they immediately are cured of their Alzheimer's. We see this quite often. We saw it in Contagion earlier in our Science Art film series, where a doctor character tests the vaccine on herself once and then the whole world can be vaccinated. And I'm curious to know whether you think that the cinematic tendency to depict fast, quick science with obvious, immediate results is damaging for our perception of science as the public.
Let's discuss.